bonsoir! Welcome to today's episode of Sewing with Mariel. So in this video, I'm going to be doing some DIY 2020 trends. So first, I'll be making a detachable fur collar and cuffs to spice up a cardigan, which gives off some y2k vibes and is inspired by the House of Sunny Peggy cardigan. I'll also be making a 90s style tank top from a regular camisole, as well as a puff sleeve blouse from a men's button-down shirt. I hope this video gives you some DIY inspo, and if you find it useful or entertaining at all, then don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get started! So first, I'll show you how to make the fur collar and cuffs. You will need a cardigan, fur fabric, a plain lining fabric, a button or hook and eye closure, and of course, your basic sewing supplies. I started off by making a pattern, and I used a bunch of loose leaf paper taped together because I didn't have pattern paper and didn't want to get more. You call it lazy, I call it resourceful. And I basically followed a YouTube tutorial on how to make a fur collar, which I will just link down below if you're interested, because I'm not here to waste your time with info that's already out there. But basically, I traced the length of the neckline of my cardigan, sketched out this collar shape, cut it out, tried it on, and made some minor adjustments, and ended up with this final collar pattern. Then I broke out my fur fabric and traced my pattern on. I traced it in 2 halves just because my fabric wasn't wide enough to fit the whole pattern, but of course you can trace the whole pattern if you don't want that seam in the back of your collar. I sewed the 2 pieces together, make sure to leave seam allowance when you cut them out, and then did the same exact thing with the lining fabric, tracing out the pattern pieces and sewing them together, but this time leaving a space in the middle to allow us to turn the collar inside out later on. Fair warning, when working with this fur fabric, be aware that you will likely get fur everywhere. If your room looks like it was viciously attacked by a bichon frise, you're doing it right. Then I put the lining and fur fabric right sides together and sewed all the way around the edge. Now turn it inside out and then sew up that gap that we left in the lining. Now the fur collar is almost done. I just added a button and a small piece of elastic to make a little loopy thing so that I can attach the 2 ends together. You can also use a hook and eye closure, but what I liked about the button and loopy is that you can make it so that you can also hook it onto the cardigan itself and wear the cardigan open. Next, to make the cuffs, this is much easier. I simply measured my wrist and made this glorified rectangle. I traced the pattern onto my fur fabric and lining fabric, cut them out, sewed them right sides together, and left a small gap to turn it inside out. Then I took a rectangular piece of white fabric just a bit smaller than the width of the cuff, sewed the edges, and turned it inside out. Then attached that to one end of the cuff. Then I simply attached 2 snap buttons on each corner of the rectangle we just made and their matching counterparts onto the other side of the cuff, and that was pretty much it. Here's the final result. I realized the Peggy cardigan from House of Sunny has more of a square collar than a pointed one, so I might change that in the future, but right now I'm scared to work with fur again because I'm still finding tiny tufts of hair and crevices all around my room days later. Plus I could just fold it and pin it in place to get the same effect. Next, I made a 90s style tank top inspired by this one top I saw in Hang TW's Instagram reel. To do this, you will need a red stretchy camisole, or any color you want really, and enough black mesh fabric to cover the entire cami. You will want a stretchy power mesh material. My red cami was actually a bit too big on the sides for me, so I took one that fit me better and laid it on top and just traced the sides with some chalk. I pinned along that line just so I know where the lines are on the front, and flipped it over and laid over my fitting cami again. After that, I cut along the side seams. You could also unpick the seam instead of cutting, but I don't got time for that. Plus my hands were hurting from sewing and using my computer and phone all day, and I swear I'm developing carpal tunnel at freaking 22 years old. Next, I got to work with my mesh fabric. I laid out the back piece and traced it onto the mesh. Pro tip, if you don't have light colored chalk, a bar of soap works great as a substitute. And of course, I traced out the top pieces as well, including the straps. I cut those pieces out, leaving a ton of seam allowance because frankly, I wasn't quite sure how this was gonna work. So I started with the back piece and pinned the sides down. Then I folded the mesh over the top and sewed that down along the edge. I did the same for the bottom hem. I also wanted the top border and the straps to be completely black, so I took some strips of the black mesh, folded that in half, then folded it over the top edge and sewed all across that edge. I repeated all of that again for the front side of the top. For this side, I also had to do the straps and left a bunch of seam allowance along the straps that allowed me to wrap the straps with the mesh fabric multiple times to get the completely black straps I was going for. I also recommend cutting slits in the excess fabric near the curves to make it easier to fold over. Finally, I put the front and back sides of the shirt right sides together and sewed along the line that I marked earlier since my camisole was a bit too big for me. Then sewed a zigzag stitch to prevent fraying and cut off the excess, and the top was complete. I ended up really liking how this turned out, and I think it looks really cute styled with a leather jacket. Finally, I made this puff sleeve top, which was the hardest of these 3 DIYs. For this, you will need a men's button-down shirt, some thin elastic, and optionally, some lining fabric. First, I started off by making a pattern for the bodice. I wanted to make a sweetheart bodice, so I followed a YouTube tutorial for making this bodice pattern with your own measurements, which I will simply link in the description box below in the interest of time. Blue sleeve paper taped together wasn't gonna cut it this time, so I broke out my Christmas wrapping paper and ended up with these pattern pieces. I traced those onto my button-down shirt and cut them out. I left a ton of extra fabric on the side of the 2 back pieces where they would meet in the middle because I wanted to be able to tie them together in the back instead of adding buttons or a zipper. Next, I sewed all those pieces together. I tried it on and realized the front section was way too big, so I simply took in about 2 centimeters of the fabric from the middle and tapered it down. I updated my wrapping paper pattern with those measurements and then repeated the whole tracing, cutting, and sewing process for my lining fabric. Like the fur collar DIY, I left a gap in one of the lining seams to later turn it inside out. I sewed the 2 pieces right side together, then cut some small slits in the excess fabric around the curves and turned it inside out before sewing up that gap in the lining. Next, I pinned all around the edges just to flatten it out so that I can top stitch along the edge. It's better to actually iron it down, but honestly, I don't own an iron. Also, I know I technically used the pins wrong and you're supposed to pin it perpendicular to the edge instead of parallel to it so that you can simply sew over the pins, but old habits die hard, and honestly, I don't trust my sewing machine to sew over the pins with no trouble. I literally wear fake glasses as safety goggles while I sew because I swear something's gonna explode in my face one day. After that, I got to work on the sleeves. I cut off the sleeves from the dress shirt and just decided to keep that sleeve shape instead of making my own sleeve pattern. Again, you call it lazy, I call it resourceful. Wow. For the part of the sleeve that will go on your shoulder, I folded the fabric over twice, leaving it wide enough for the elastic to fit inside. Sew that down, again leaving it wide enough for the elastic to fit in, so don't sew right down the middle. I left a little gap open, attached a safety pin to one end of my elastic, and threaded it through that pocket I just made. Then I sewed down the 2 ends of the elastic and closed up the hole. Then for the other end of the sleeve, I folded that over twice as well. Sewed that down about 1 inch from the edge, and while I was sewing, I let it bunch up instead of pulling it taut. Then I pulled the end of the thread to bunch it up a little more. You can look up ruching tutorials for more information on that. Finally, I simply attached the sleeves to the side of the bodice for the finished piece. I like how it turned out, although I definitely think there are improvements I can make. I think I need to fix my bodice pattern to fit my body better, or maybe even make a bodice with boning to add more structure to the top. There's so many improvements I can make, but I think I did alright for someone who doesn't usually make clothes from scratch. Okay, so that concludes today's video. I hope this was useful and gave you some inspo for some future sewing projects. And if you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, follow me on Instagram, and let me know in the comments what you want to see in the future. See you guys in the next one.